Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what I am about to share comes from conversations with people inside Tehran's decision-making apparatus, and what they are telling me is that Iran has made a strategic decision that is going to fundamentally reshape the Middle East. Iran is done negotiating from a position of weakness. Iran is done accepting terms dictated by Washington. And most importantly, Iran is willing to accept economic pain, international isolation, and even military confrontation rather than surrender the strategic capabilities it has spent 40 years building. I am looking at internal communications from the US State Department that were leaked to multiple journalists in the past 72 hours. These are not public statements. These are frank assessments intended for senior policymakers. And the language is remarkable. One memo, written by a senior diplomat with decades of Middle East experience, states bluntly that Iran is not bluffing, our leverage is largely exhausted, and we are heading toward either a major policy revision or a direct military confrontation for which we are unprepared. Another memo notes that European allies are openly questioning American strategy and that China and Russia are actively working to undermine sanctions enforcement. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what changed in Tehran that produced this new posture of absolute refusal, why American diplomats are panicking behind closed doors while maintaining public confidence, and why the next phase of this confrontation will be far more dangerous than anything we have seen so far. This is not analysis filtered through Washington think tanks or sanitized by government press offices. This is ground truth from people who are living this crisis every day. Let's start with what actually changed in Tehran, because understanding Iranian decision-making requires understanding how Iran's political system works and who holds real power. Iran is not a democracy in the Western sense, but it is also not a dictatorship where one man makes all decisions. It is a complex system where multiple power centers, the supreme leader, the elected president, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the clerical establishment, compete and negotiate to produce policy. For years, there was a meaningful split between what Western analysts called moderates and hardliners. The moderates, associated with former President Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif, believed that accommodation with the West was possible and beneficial. They negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal. They argued that Iran could achieve security and prosperity through diplomacy rather than confrontation. The hardliners, centered in the Revolutionary Guard and among conservative clerics, always viewed Western engagement with suspicion and argued that only military strength and regional influence could protect Iran from American regime change efforts. Trump's decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal in 2018 and impose maximum pressure sanctions destroyed the moderate argument. Rouhani and Zarif had told the Iranian people, negotiate with the West, make concessions on the nuclear program, and Iran will be welcomed back into the international community. Instead, Iran made concessions and the United States withdrew from the agreement anyway, reimposed sanctions, and demanded even greater concessions. The moderates were discredited. The hardliners were vindicated. According to analysts at the International Crisis Group who maintain contacts in Tehran, the current Iranian government under President Raisi represents the complete ascendance of the hardline faction. But more importantly, there is now a consensus across the Iranian political spectrum that the moderate approach failed and will not be tried again. Even Iranians who would prefer engagement with the West no longer believe it is achievable, so they support resistance as the only viable strategy. This shift is not rhetorical. It is structural. It means that Iran's nuclear program will continue regardless of sanctions or threats. It means Iran's ballistic missile development will accelerate. It means Iran's support for regional allies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen will be maintained. And it means that any American or Israeli military action will be met with retaliation calibrated to impose maximum cost without triggering a war Iran cannot win. Subscribe if you are realizing that the assumptions underlying American-Iran policy are completely divorced from reality on the ground. Now let's talk about why American diplomats are panicking and what their internal communications reveal. Announcement number 1, the sanctions are not working, and American officials know they are not working. But they cannot admit it publicly without acknowledging that the centerpiece of US-Iran policy for 5 years has been a failure. The leaked State Department memos include detailed analysis of sanctions impact. The assessment is devastating. Iran's oil exports have declined but not stopped. Approximately 1 million barrels per day are still being exported, mostly to China through elaborate smuggling networks. Iran has developed barter arrangements with Russia and China that bypass dollar-denominated trade. Iran's domestic industry has adapted by producing local substitutes for imported goods. The Iranian currency stabilized after an initial crash. Inflation is high but manageable. The government has maintained control despite economic hardship. One memo includes a sentence that should end the debate about sanctions' effectiveness. It states, maximum pressure has imposed significant costs on the Iranian economy, but has not changed Iranian behavior on any of the core issues we care about. Nuclear enrichment has accelerated. Missile development has continued. Regional activities have expanded. The supreme leader's position is secure. In other words, sanctions have caused pain but not produced policy change. This creates a political problem for the administration. If sanctions are not working, the policy has failed. But admitting the policy has failed requires explaining what comes next. Military action, politically unacceptable. Negotiation requires making concessions that the administration has spent years saying it would never make. Continued sanctions, despite their proven ineffectiveness, produces diminishing credibility and looks like stubborn refusal to adapt to reality. According to reporting by the New York Times based on interviews with current and former officials, there are furious internal debates within the administration about whether to continue maximum pressure or shift to a new approach. But those debates are going nowhere because Trump himself refuses to admit that his policy is not working. So officials are trapped implementing a policy they privately acknowledge is failing while publicly defending it as successful. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. America's regional allies are terrified and are beginning to hedge their bets. This is the part that reveals how much strategic ground the United States has lost. The leaked diplomatic cables include communications between American embassies in the Gulf states and the State Department. The message from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain is consistent. They are worried that American confrontation with Iran will turn their countries into battlegrounds. They are urging restraint and diplomatic engagement, and they are quietly reaching out to Tehran to establish back channels that could prevent escalation. Stay with me because this is where the entire regional security architecture that the United States built over 70 years begins to unravel. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both fought proxy wars against Iranian influence in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. But both countries have come to recognize that those conflicts were expensive failures that strengthened rather than weakened Iranian regional position. Now they are pursuing de-escalation. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in 2023 through Chinese mediation. The UAE has quietly increased economic ties with Iran despite American pressure. Kuwait and Oman have maintained relations throughout. What this means in practice is that America's closest Arab allies will not support military action against Iran. They will not allow their territory to be used for launching attacks. They will not join sanctions enforcement efforts. They may publicly support American positions, but privately, they are prioritizing their own security over American strategic objectives, and their security requires not being caught in the middle of a US-Iran war. One diplomatic cable from the US Embassy in Abu Dhabi is particularly revealing. It notes that Emirati officials have made clear that while they value their security partnership with the United States, they cannot afford to be seen as American proxies in a conflict with Iran. The cable goes on to say that the UAE is pursuing what it calls strategic autonomy, which means maintaining relationships with both Washington and Tehran and refusing to choose sides definitively. This is a diplomatic earthquake. For decades, American strategy in the Gulf depended on Arab states aligning with Washington against Tehran. That alignment is collapsing, not because the Arab states love Iran, but because they have concluded that American protection is not reliable enough to justify the risks of permanent confrontation with a neighbor they cannot escape. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this is the part that reveals why diplomats are truly panicking. Iran is not just refusing to blink. Iran is escalating in ways designed to expose American impotence and force a crisis that Trump cannot ignore but also cannot solve. In the past 30 days, Iranian-backed groups have conducted attacks on US forces in Syria and Iraq approximately 40 times. These are not major attacks. They are drones and rockets that cause minimal damage. But they are persistent, they are increasing in frequency, and they are designed to present the United States with an impossible choice. If the United States does not respond, it looks weak and emboldens further attacks. If the United States does respond with airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias, Iran retaliates against US bases or regional allies, and the cycle of escalation continues. If the United States responds with strikes against Iran itself, Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz and launches missiles at Saudi and Emirati oil facilities, triggering a regional war. According to defense officials quoted in Politico, the Pentagon has presented the White House with multiple options for responding to the attacks. But every option carries unacceptable risks. Limited strikes against militia targets have not deterred previous attacks and will not deter future ones. Larger strikes risk triggering the escalation spiral. Doing nothing invites more attacks and damages American credibility. This is strategic paralysis. One leaked memo from a National Security Council meeting includes a remarkable admission. The memo states that Iran appears to have concluded that the United States will not risk a major war over low-level provocations, and they are testing the limits of what they can do without triggering an American military response that would force them to escalate. In other words, Iran is playing a game of brinkmanship where they probe American red lines and then step right up to those lines without quite crossing them. This is a very dangerous game. It relies on both sides accurately reading each other's intentions and limits. But in a crisis atmosphere with poor communication and domestic political pressure on both sides to look strong, the odds of miscalculation are high. One errant drone strike that kills American soldiers. One American airstrike that kills Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers. One misinterpreted signal. And suddenly, both countries are in a war neither wanted, but both are now committed to fighting. Now let's talk about what you are not hearing from any mainstream outlet, which is the human cost and the moral dimension of this crisis. Because behind all the strategic analysis and policy debates are real people whose lives are being destroyed. Economic sanctions are killing people in Iran, not directly through violence, but through deprivation. Sanctions restrict Iran's ability to import medicines, medical equipment, and spare parts for water treatment and electrical infrastructure. According to Human Rights Watch and verified by UN agencies, Iranian patients with cancer, diabetes, and rare diseases have died because medications were unavailable due to sanctions. Children have died from treatable illnesses because hospitals lacked equipment or supplies. The Trump administration argues that humanitarian goods are exempt from sanctions. That is technically true, but practically false. Banks will not process transactions with Iranian entities, even for humanitarian goods, because they fear being penalized for sanctions violations. Shipping companies will not transport goods to Iran for the same reason. The result is that while food and medicine are theoretically allowed, the financial infrastructure required to purchase and transport them is blocked. This is not speculation. This is documented by the US Treasury Department's own records. Applications for humanitarian exemptions to sanctions are routinely delayed for months or denied outright. Companies that try to export humanitarian goods to Iran face such extensive bureaucratic requirements and legal risks that most simply choose not to bother. Real people are dying. Real families are suffering. And for what? To force Iran to give up nuclear and missile programs that Iran views as essential to its survival and that sanctions have demonstrably failed to stop. The policy is cruel and ineffective simultaneously. That combination should be politically untenable. But it continues because acknowledging failure would require changing course, and changing course would require admitting error. This pattern appears throughout history whenever great powers try to use economic coercion to force political change. The League of Nations' sanctions against Italy after its invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 failed to stop Italian aggression, but did cause humanitarian suffering. The US embargo against Cuba has lasted 60 years without achieving its objective of toppling the Castro regime. The sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s killed hundreds of thousands of civilians without weakening Saddam Hussein's grip on power. The lesson is clear. Economic sanctions can impose costs, but they rarely produce the political outcomes they are designed to achieve. They are most effective when the target has a democratic government that is responsive to public suffering. They are least effective when the target has an authoritarian government that can insulate decision-makers from economic pain and shift blame for suffering onto the sanctioning country. Iran fits the latter category. The Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard Corps are not going to change policy because ordinary Iranians cannot access medications. They will use that suffering to rally nationalist sentiment against America. They will frame resistance as a matter of national survival and dignity, and they will wait out the sanctions for as long as it takes. So where does this leave us? 3 paths, and the choice between them will be made in the next few months. Path 1. The United States recognizes that maximum pressure has failed, quietly walks back its demands, and pursues a negotiated settlement that accepts Iran as a threshold nuclear state with defensive military capabilities in exchange for verification measures and regional security guarantees. This requires political courage that Trump has not demonstrated, but it is the path that avoids catastrophic outcomes. Path 2. The current stalemate continues with both sides locked in confrontation that neither can win, but neither will abandon. Periodic crises, occasional military clashes, economic warfare, humanitarian suffering, no resolution. This is the path of least resistance politically, but also the path most likely to eventually produce accidental escalation into full war. Path 3, either through deliberate decision or miscalculation, the United States and Iran stumble into a regional war. Oil markets crash, global recession, thousands dead, American forces trapped in an unwinnable conflict. Trump's presidency destroyed, Iranian government weakened but not toppled, regional instability for decades. This is the nightmare scenario, and every day we stay on path 2 makes path 3 more likely. I believe path 2 is where we are currently, but the leaked diplomatic cables suggest that some officials are desperately trying to shift to path 1 before path 3 happens by accident. Whether they succeed depends on politics, not strategy. And politics, especially American domestic politics in an election year, rarely produces optimal foreign policy outcomes. Here are the questions you should be asking. First, are you comfortable with a policy that is causing verifiable humanitarian harm without achieving its stated objectives? Second, do you trust that the people making decisions about potential war with Iran understand the costs and risks, or are they operating on assumptions disconnected from reality? Third, what is your personal threshold for acceptable risk when it comes to policies that could trigger regional war and global economic crisis? Tell me in the comments whether you think diplomacy is still possible or whether we are watching the slow-motion march toward war. Tell me what you think happens when the next American soldier is killed by an Iranian-backed group. We are monitoring this from multiple sources, and we will keep you updated as the situation develops. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to understand that what is happening between the United States and Iran is not a chess game played by rational actors with perfect information. It is a confrontation between countries with incompatible positions, limited communication, domestic political pressures, and historical grievances. That is exactly the kind of situation that produces wars nobody wanted. Turn on notifications because this story is far from over. We will see you in the next update.